I'm going to be talking to Katarina Savic, who's a researcher for the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and a co-author of a new study called Post-COVID-19 Indigenous Economic Recovery, Reconciliation in the Energy Transition. So basically the argument is that greater Indigenous ownership in Canada of renewable energy projects after the pandemic's over can contribute to Indigenous reconciliation, self-determination, and economic recovery. So welcome to the interview, Katarina.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So greater control by Indigenous, First Nations and Indigenous communities in Canada. You listed in the paper with your co-author some of the benefits. One of them is right and title to land. Could you explain why that's important, please?
Yes, for sure. And I think before I should do that, I should acknowledge the land that I'm coming in from in good fashion. So I'm calling from Toronto, Ontario, and that is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, Chippewas, and Mississaugas of the New Credit. I'm born and raised in Toronto, but my parents are immigrants to this country. So I'm just want to give thanks and appreciation that I can be here, live here on their land. And so with renewable energy and the rights and title to their land, so with the government of Canada, they have the duty to consult and accommodate with all kind of projects or developments on Indigenous territories, and specifically that affect First Nations and their communities. And so with that duty to consult, there comes acknowledgement that Indigenous people and First Nations are rights holders to their land. And that means they have to be consulted with in the beginning of any project, any planning, and that they are real partners in all kinds of projects and developments on their land. And that responsibility has also been now downloaded onto the private sector. So private developers that want to develop any kind of projects, they need to follow that and engage with First Nations early on in any project and consider them as, viable partners, equity partners in all projects.
Now, the second benefit that you listed in the study is the importance of own source revenue. Can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll just back up a bit. So for our research to explore how renewable energy can connect with and contribute to reconciliation self-determination, we looked at data set of 157 active renewable energy projects with grid-connected First Nations. And then we interviewed a few First Nations EDCs from across different provinces and territories. So what are EDCs? Those are economic development corporations. That is the economic branch of a First Nation. And they are for-profit business entities, and their purpose is job and wealth creation for the community. And so that's where own source revenue comes in, because with Government of Canada has a fiduciary duty to provide funds every year to First Nations to support their functions and community services and so on. That annual transfer of funds, that's earmarked by the government. They're told how to spend that money. There's immense burdensome reporting every single year. And that's where own source revenue comes in, where the First Nations and their EDCs, they're seeking business opportunities, partnerships where they can make their own money and decide for themselves how they want to spend or reinvest their profits. And that's so closely tied from what we heard to self-determination, being able to control their lives and their land and their money.
Now, the third benefit is one that I find very interesting. We don't talk about this a lot, and that's the importance of community and nation capacity building. So if you're going to do projects like this, there's a tremendous amount of expertise that's required. You need to be able to manage the project. You have to have the technical skills. You have to have the financial skills. These are not insignificant projects, and taking them on builds the capacity to do all of that within the nation. Have I got that right?
Yeah, definitely. And so for partnerships, there's many different benefits to them, but definitely one of them is capacity building for the First Nation, but also for the non-Indigenous entity as well. So for example, for maybe a large-scale hydro where they're collaborating, partnering with a local First Nation, oftentimes there would be maybe the chief or counselor or someone else on the board of directors or involved in day-to-day operations, as well as making sure that their youth and community members are employed in that project. So really throughout all different levels, we want to make sure that there's First Nations decision-making authority, which again builds their experience and their expertise in renewable energy projects, and hopefully more and more, we can see more and more of 100% First Nations owned renewable energy projects.
Right, and of course this is important because many First Nations are located in remote areas that are not part, it's not easy to develop these kinds of projects or to participate in other local, in the local economy. So it's very important to have that capacity to do local development. So let's talk about the economic development corporations. In your study, you argue that 50-50 joint ventures with private sector companies is the best model. Could you explain why that is, please?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's maybe not the best model, but it's a good model for certain reasons. And maybe I should, preface, there's three kind of scenarios for Indigenous ownership and participation in renewable energy projects. The first scenario is if, the project is not owned at all by Indigenous company, and instead the Indigenous community has an IBA, impact benefit agreement, or an MOU, and they receive some benefits. That's a scenario we don't really, like. And then on the other side of the spectrum is when a First Nation wholly owns their renewable energy project, which we see many across Canada. And in the middle of that, between the two scenarios, would be partnerships and joint ventures, usually between First Nations and non-Indigenous, sometimes between Indigenous and Indigenous partnerships, but usually it's between First Nation and a non-Indigenous business or government. And that's what we heard from the interviews was that those partnerships and joint ventures, it really embraces the true intent of the treaties, which was to share the resources and land between the nation for Indigenous nations and settlers. And that really embodies reconciliation, is moving forward, rebuilding the broken nation-to-nation relationships, and renewable energy can definitely play a part in that.
So I understand the partnership between the private sector and First Nations, but what about build partnerships with government? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, similarly with even the private sector, with even Hydro-Quebec, BC Hydro, Hydro One, for any kind of new projects being developed, definitely having to include Indigenous communities, First Nations from the very beginning. And if First Nations are looking to be equity partners in that project, that option definitely has to be in the table. From what we heard from the interviews is that, again, First Nations and their EDCs, they're not looking for IBAs anymore. They want to have ownership and control over these projects and decision-making authority. And that comes with equity partnerships, whether it's public sector with Indigenous communities or private sector Indigenous communities.
I want to interject an important point here because quite often the capital for renewable energy projects doesn't come from the government. Some of it may, and that does happen, but more and more, as I understand it, First Nations are able to go to investors, they're able to go to banks, they're able to raise bonds, to participate. They can finance their own participation. They're not dependent upon government to finance it for them. Is that an accurate observation?
Definitely. And we have to, First Nations EDCs, they're really big players across the country. At CCAB, the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, we see more EDCs being established every year. They're growing. They exist in every single industry sector. They're really growing every single year. And they do have the equity. They do have the capital to participate. Yes, there is still the barrier to accessing financing, especially for businesses located on reserve. But there are ways to overcome that. But yes, First Nations and the EDCs, they're definitely valid players and are looking for equity partnerships. They have the funds to support that.
Now, you mentioned something, you mentioned it a couple of times during this interview, and I have certainly heard it with Indigenous leaders in other interviews, and that is that First Nations don't feel respected when they sit down at the negotiating table with the private sector partners, with government, and their message to those other partners is very simple. Do not treat us as an afterthought. We want to be in the process from the very beginning and treat us like partners at the beginning. We will be very good partners. But if you come and treat us as an afterthought at the end just to fulfill your consultation duties, that's when problems arise. Is that fair?
Yes. Yes, definitely. We heard in interviews and also with from our business members at CCAB is that, of course, First Nations, they want to be equity partners. And I think sometimes with these challenges with maybe their meetings with public or private sector as it relates to renewable energy, I think that some folks have an idea that First Nations are anti-development and that they're a barrier to business and all of these kinds of negative ideas, and that's simply not true. First Nations and their EDCs are looking for business opportunities that make sense for them, that address their community needs, that respects their rights, their land and waters, and also to think about the next 7 generations. So we don't have to compromise the two. And you're right, they want to be included in the beginning. Not only does that fulfill the duty to consult and accommodate, but that's because that shows the First Nations that they're respected as the rights holders to their land and respected as real business partners that can bring a lot to the table.
So let's talk about the final question, Katrina, which is the role of federal and provincial governments with respect to First Nations and EDCs around renewable energy. Do we have the right policies, or are there improvements that are required?
Yes, we've had some and then we've gone away, and there's more work to be done. From in our research, we showed was after the Supreme Court of Canada decision for the duty to consult and accommodate, after the Ontario Feed-in Tariff Program, the BC Clean Energy Act, we saw a real rise of Indigenous ownership and participation in renewable energy projects. In our research, we didn't have the time to really explore the analysis in depth, but there is a trend to show that yes, supportive provincial and federal policies are instrumental to the success of large Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects. So in Ontario, we had the Feed-in Tariff Program with Aboriginal price adder, and we saw a boom of great Indigenous partnerships and wholly Indigenous-owned renewable energy projects. The first 100% wind farm Indigenous owned was in Ontario because of that Aboriginal price adder. So definitely in the spirit of economic reconciliation, I really encourage all provincial and federal policies to think about ways to stimulate more Indigenous ownership in renewable energy projects. Not only does it contribute to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but it contributes to the government's role in economic reconciliation with First Nations.
Katarina, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much.